So again, my name is Scott Mitchell. I'm here at the Silver River, and today's mystery object has to do with the settlement of Florida, and it is here in the museum. And actually, I'm in the museum. So this is an unusual object that is very rare, and I will tell you a little bit more about it here. Teachers, if you were able to download and print one of these forms, that's great. It gives the students a place to capture notes and then record some observations. If not, it's okay. It's just an optional feature that we have. And I am going to switch cameras and we're going to talk about today's museum mystery object. It's off to my left. Right there, you can just see the top of it, but I have a different camera. So we're going to switch over and we're going to talk about it a little bit. So some of you may already have a pretty good idea of what it is. It's very, very old. It's made of metal and it's pretty heavy. It's the size of, it's a little bit bigger than a basketball. Let's put it that way. So it's a pretty good size object and it's very heavy. And it's very, very old, and it was found here, right here in Marion County in the Ocklawaha River by a diver back in the 1960s. There was a scuba diver going down the river, and he saw this thing laying on the bottom of the river, and he dove down there and picked it up and brought it to his boat and took it home with him. And then later he donated it here to the museum. So first of all, what do you notice about this object? Teachers, you can have your students take a few minutes and just record some observations and maybe a few questions, but it is made out of bronze, which is a type of metal. It has some decoration on it, which I will tell you about a little bit more here in just a minute. But teachers, if you have ideas from your students, have them tell you and send me a couple of chats, and let's get some ideas from the students about what this thing might be. It's a very rare object. You've probably seen them before, but this one is rare, and I will tell you why in just a minute. But I want to know if the students have a clue about what it is. So send me a few chats. You should have your students talking about what it could possibly be. Oh, Mrs. Golden, second grade, I think she nailed it. I've got church bell, ship's bell, bell. All right, so we know that it's a bell. It is a bell for sure. And that's pretty obvious just by the shape of it. Now, what was it doing in the river? It would make sense that it was a ship's bell because there used to be steamboats that would go up and down the river, and maybe the one sank years ago. But if you look at it very closely, there is actually a cross here. And I've got some different photographs that show you a better detail about that cross. So the cross tells us, like Mrs. Golden class's idea, that it is very likely a church bell. But what would a church bell be doing in the Ocklawaha River? And it's obviously very, very old. Now, here are some clues. There were other things found nearby, and you can see some of these other things. These are pieces of broken pottery, Indian spear points, some glass beads like you would wear in a necklace, some old nails. Now, very old stuff. The beads are interesting because glass beads are kind of like cars. You can look at a car and tell if it's from the 1950s or if it's a brand new car, right? If you look at a car, you can tell if it's brand new or if it's like an old beat up, jalopy. Well, glass beads are the same way. Glass beads were made certain ways during certain times, and the glass beads that were found with this bell were from very early Spanish explorers and missionaries, priests who would come and bring religion to the Indians that were living here in Florida. So you guys pretty much nailed it. We got a church bell, but we're going to talk about why a church bell would be in the Ocklawaha River. And to do that, I have a few interesting photographs that I want to show you. So I'm going to start share screen. And if you were with me last week, or the week before, I guess, you would remember that the last museum mystery object we had was this conquistador's helmet. And you can see the picture of the conquistador there. These were Spanish soldiers. Some of the very first Spanish explorers were actually Spanish soldiers that came to Florida looking for gold and silver about 500 years ago. You can see the ship on the painting back behind me. They came all the way across the ocean from Spain in ships, and they were basically looking for gold and silver. When they got to Florida, they realized there was no gold and silver here, but they wanted to keep control of this territory. And so they brought with them, this is today's museum mystery object. And you can see the drawing on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see the cross there that's part of the design of the bell. That's a very good indicator that it is a church bell. So that's a better photograph of the old church bell. So these first Spanish explorers from Spain, they were Catholic. Catholic was the religion that they practiced, Catholicism. They were Catholics, and they brought their religion with them. Now, the Native Americans that were already here were the Timucuan Indians, and they weren't Catholics. They had their own religion, but the Spanish explorers wanted to teach the Florida Indians about their religion. They wanted them to be Catholics also. They felt like that's what you had to do to go to heaven. And so they would, this is a painting of one of the very first church services, maybe on the beach where the Spaniards landed. And you can see some soldiers there and a couple of Indians off to the side. And it probably didn't look this fancy, but this is an artist's painting about what one of those very early church services would have looked like. But the soldiers brought priests with them. And the priests were called missionaries because they would go on missions off into the wilds of whatever land that they arrived in, and they would teach the people there about their particular religion. And we actually still have missionaries today. Some people will go live in another country and they'll tell other people about their particular religion. So in Florida, the Spanish missionaries that came along with those very first early explorers went off into the wilds, and they found big Indian villages, right? So little towns basically, and they would bring all kinds of nice things with them to trade with the Indians, like glass beads, right? Remember the glass beads? And they would make friends with the Indians, and they would build a church there at the Indian village. And we called these mission churches. So here is a map of the north part of Florida, and each little red dot is a mission church. And remember, these are 500 or 600 years ago, really long time ago. You can see St. Augustine would be way off to this side of the map, and Tallahassee's way off to that side of the map. And there's a road that goes between the two. They were Spanish towns, and each little red dot is a mission church at a big Indian village. So if you were traveling across that Spanish road, you could walk all day or ride a horse if you were lucky, and you would get to stop at one of those mission churches for the night. And so these mission churches were built across North Florida. This is a painting of what one of the mission churches up near Tallahassee looked like. And this mission was called Mission San Luis, which was basically the Church of St. Louis. They would name the missions after saints. So you can see right in the middle of the painting, there's a big building. This would be the church. And the smaller building off to the left would be where the priests lived. And then all these other buildings would be where the Indians lived. There was a big kind of game field or plaza in the middle of the village. And then there was a big Indian meeting house off to the right. And archaeologists, who are scientists that go and dig up the ground where people used to live long ago, have actually gone. This mission church is no longer here. None of the buildings are there anymore. They all fell apart and went back down into the ground over time. But archaeologists went and they dug this place up, and they found out where all the buildings were. So that's how we know what it looked like. This is a picture. They have rebuilt the church. You can actually go there if you want. If you're in Tallahassee, you can drive over to Mission San Luis and you can see what the original church would have looked like. So this is a building that they have rebuilt to look like the original one. and it's really quite large. That's a picture of the outside, obviously. Let's see, here is the inside. That's the inside of the church at San Luis. And this is pretty close to what those early Spanish churches would have looked like. Now, we called these missions again. So there were missions along the Ocklawaha River. There were 3 of them in the 1600s, first part of the 1600s. So the people who lived there would have joined the Catholic religion, and they would have been friends with the Spanish priests, and they would have raised corn and kind of lived in these villages around the church. This is what some of the people might have looked like that were living in those early Spanish missions. This is a picture of some of the archaeological clues that we find. You can see the plate on the right. This is a Spanish plate from the 1600s. And like the glass beads, you can tell by looking at this plate that it's an old Spanish plate if you study old Spanish plates. And so the little pieces over on the other side, those are pieces of broken Spanish plates from the 1600s. And so when you find pieces like this, so here are a couple of little pieces of Spanish plates from the woods next to where the bell was found on the river. These aren't really very interesting artifacts, but if you know what you're looking for and you can recognize these as being parts of that Spanish plate, then you begin to realize that you're dealing with an old Spanish mission site. So I'm going to show you those again. I'll bring these up pretty close to the camera. These are little pieces of Spanish pottery, basically, that the priests would have brought all the way from Spain. And then we also find these little tiny glass beads. They're very small, and they're like the kind of things you would wear on a necklace. So those are clues that tell us that this church bell belonged to an old Spanish mission church along the Ocklawaha River. Now let's go one step further. We go to the old Spanish records. The Spaniards kept very good records, and they wrote down the names of the churches and when they were in operation. And this church bell is actually from a mission called San Luis de Ocali, and it operated between 1620 and 1656, which is a very, very long time ago. So now you guys know the rest of the story, and the museum mystery object, the church bell, is actually an old Spanish mission bell, which is pretty interesting if you think about it. And it's very, very old. It's over, well, it's about 500 years old. So with that, teachers, if you all have questions, I would be happy to answer them. And now you know about the old Spanish mission bell. Oh, let me back up a step. When the mission was shut down, when the priests left, somehow the bell ended up in the river. That's the end of the story. So we're not sure. I see a question from Miss Nichols. We're not sure how the bell ended up in the river. It could have been thrown in there by the Indians who were upset with the priests, or the priests could have put it in the river to hide it so it wouldn't be bothered by anybody, or maybe it was dropped in the river by accident. We're not sure, but somehow it ended up in the river, and it laid there for about 400 or 500 years till that river diver found it. Okay. All right, do we have more questions? And teachers, remember, if you joined us late, please make sure to send me a chat with your name and your school and your grade so I can keep track of which schools and teachers I'm working with. So do we have other questions? I see some hands up. You got to get your teachers to send me a chat, because we have so many classes right now with us. There's 11 classrooms with us. I can't talk to everybody over the microphone. It would be too confusing for my ears. So do we have other questions about the old museum, the old church bell in the museum here? The way that this relates to the settlement of Florida in Hispanic Heritage Month is basically these mission sites that were built across Florida brought more and more Europeans and Spaniards to Florida, and Florida was actually part of Spain up until about 1820. That's when it became part of the United States. So the bell is a very good clue about the settlement of Florida. Okay, so I see a few questions here. Let me back up. All right, the kids are thinking that a hurricane could have caused the river to end up, or the bell to end up in the river. That is certainly possible. When hurricanes come along, the wind is extra strong and it could have gotten blown into the river. That's a pretty good guess. We're not quite sure, but that's certainly a possibility. If the bell, here's another question. If the bell is brown, does it mean it was at the deep end of the river? Well, it's brown because the way that the bronze turns a different color when it lays in the river or the dirt for so long, it's kind of like when metal gets rusty, it turns kind of reddish or brown. Bronze does the same thing. Usually it would be kind of a shiny brass color when it was new. And we don't want to clean it because it's so old. We're just going to leave it like the way it is. Okay. How do we know how the bell was made? This is a very interesting question. Bells were made by melting metal. So they would take metal and they would get it so hot, it would turn into liquid like lava, right? And then they would have a form ready in the shape of a bell that was like a hollow space in the shape of a bell. And they would pour that hot metal into that shape. It's called a mold, and the hot metal would flow down into the mold and take the shape of a bell. And when it cooled off, they would take the mold away and there you would have a bell. So that's how this bell was made. It's called a cast bell, and they get the metal so hot they can make it into any shape they want. Okay, the Spanish made it. We know that it's a Spanish bell. There's a question from Miss Smith about who made it. So we know the Spaniards would have made it. And it probably was made in Spain or maybe even South America. It was not made in Florida. They did not have the ability to make bells here in Florida back in those days. Okay, we have a question about, does it still make noise and how loud is it? Well, this bell is so old and so valuable and so rare. This is the only bell like it that's ever been found here in the eastern part of the United States, really. It's a one-of-a-kind object. So we don't want to test how loud it is. I'm sure it still makes noise, but it's very fragile and old, so we're not going to do that. But I'm sure it would make noise and it would sound like a bell, like a church bell. So they were pretty loud. All right. From Miss Johnson, Ace would like to know what the cross means. Well, because it was a church bell, and the church is a symbol of Christianity in the Catholic Church. The priests, when they ordered the bell, when they were talking to the people who made the bell, they probably said, hey, put a church on it or put a cross on it because it's going to be a church bell. It symbolizes what it was for. Okay, is the picture behind me connected to the bell? Well, like I said earlier, the picture behind me shows a sailing ship with Spanish explorers coming off the ship, getting in their rowboat, getting ready to go to shore. And so these are some of the very first Spanish explorers, and those missionaries, those priests who would have built churches were with them. So in a way, the picture does relate to the bell. Okay, and another question from Miss Johnson's class. Gianna wants to know if the bell still rings. We think it does, but it's old and delicate, so we're not going to test it out. Okay. Now, does anyone have any other questions? And one more reminder for the teachers, if you haven't texted me, please do, and just let me know what school you're with and what grade you have. And I hope that you all found today's museum mystery object interesting. Did you all know that there were Spanish missionaries and churches here 400 or 500 years ago, right here in Marion County down on the Ocklawaha River? They were, and we have one of their bells right here in the Silver River Museum. If you all want to see the bell, you can come out to the museum. It's open every Saturday and Sunday, and you can come in the back room where the Spanish cannons are, and the bell is in a case right here in the museum. All right. We'll give it one more minute to see if anyone has any other questions. And teachers, remember that every other week I will be available for Zoom museum mystery sessions. So I will be back with you for grades K through 2 in 2 weeks, and I'll have a different object, and we'll still be in Hispanic Heritage Month. So it will have to do with the settlement of Florida by early Spanish explorers. Okay. All right. Well, I hope you all have a great day. Those were wonderful questions, students. And I hope that you get to come to the museum one day and see the bell in person. And I will see you all in 2 weeks for our next museum mystery Zoom lesson. Okay, so that takes care of today, and you all have a good rest of the day. Bye. Bye, everybody.